Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, welcome. My name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I mostly focus on unsolved true crime. I share the stories of missing, murdered, unidentified people, but sometimes it's pertinent to share the story of a solved case. Today we're going to be talking about the solved case of a woman called Sophie Lancaster, who was senselessly murdered here in the UK in August 2007 just for the crime of dressing differently. She was a Goth. She loved the community she found within the Gothic subculture. Sophie's story quickly took over the headlines, and ever since then, the people who loved her in life have dedicated their lives to fighting against violence and intolerance, to educating people, ensuring that this doesn't happen again. A portion of the proceeds of this video today will be being donated directly to the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, a charity set up in 2009 to create a lasting legacy for Sophie, to provide educational group works that will challenge the prejudice and intolerance towards people from alternative subcultures. And as well as that, it wanted to campaign to have the UK hate crime legislation extended to include people from alternative subcultures. Using Sophie's legacy, the foundation aims to change a generation, to promote tolerance and acceptance for all. And you know that is exactly what I stand for on my channel, on my platforms here on the internet as well. It's what I always try and promote and put forward through my content. So I really can't think of a foundation that I would rather donate towards. So I'm asking you as viewers to please stick with the ads throughout this video. If you're able to and they're not the annoying 10-minute ads, please watch them all the way through. I know ads on YouTube videos are annoying, but this is such an easy way for you to be an active viewer of true crime, to actively make a difference in the world. The last time I did this, I think I was able to donate nearly £300 to the DNA Doe project, so it really does help. So let me tell you the story of Sophie Lancaster. Sophie was born on the 26th of November 1986 in Lancashire to her parents Sylvia and John. And from a very young age, it was clear that Sophie very much had her own mind. At the age of 6, she announced to her family that she was going vegetarian, and she remained so for the rest of her life. Sophie was very in tune with world issues. She hated injustice, with The Guardian writing that by the age of 9, she was preaching to her family about world poverty. She did not miss a trick. Her mum Sylvia had recently started a sociology degree, and Sylvia would often have friends round from the course. They'd just sit around discussing it, while Sophie would just sit there and listen. Sophie was also a voracious reader. She easily finished a book in a day, and this is another trait of hers that would clearly hang around for the rest of her life. At the time of her death, she was actually on a gap year before starting an English degree. I think she was actually due to start it the very next month. At high school, Sophie had achieved the second best mark in the year in her English exams. As well as a reader, she was a very good writer. In her early teenage years, Sophie had started taking an interest in Goth style after getting very close with a friend whose family dressed in the same way. Sylvia said to The Guardian that Sophie developed her own style. She wore a full-length black leather coat and dyed her hair black. It was just who she was. Although it seems Sophie did receive some backlash from the outside world by her style, her family were always supportive. She actually grew up in Haslingden with her parents and her older brother Adam, and it seems like not long before her death her parents had actually split up, but by that point Sophie had moved out and was now living with her long-term boyfriend Robert Maltby, who was known as Rob, and they'd been together for about 3 years. Sophie and Rob were very similar. They were both into sort of goth style and goth culture, and they had very similar views on the world. They were very open-minded people. They didn't believe in judging others by their appearance, something that wasn't extended to them. The Museum of Youth Culture describes goth as a music category, a fashion style, a lifestyle, and is often categorised by an affiliation to a dark aesthetic. It evolved from other youth subcultures like punk from the 70s through to the 90s, and is thought to have started in the UK before spreading across the whole world. And as according to Wikipedia, the goth subculture is marked by its emphasis on individualism, tolerance for diversity, a strong emphasis on creativity, tendency towards intellectualism, and a mild tendency towards cynicism. The culture is much, much more than a fashion style, although outwardly that is the most obvious indicator that somebody is goth. And then from a more sort of like personal fascination angle, Hodgkinson wrote in 2002 that the emphasis for both males and females on a feminine appearance was also linked with the general acceptance and sometimes even veneration of sexual ambiguity. While the majority of Goths behaved in accordance with heterosexual norms throughout wider society, there was little, if any, disapproval or surprise in Goth clubs at the occasional sight of people of the same sex holding hands, cuddling, or kissing. So, the Goth subculture, with their dark clothes, mohawks, fishnets, and leather, were much more accepting throughout history than the majority of society. A Goth is much more likely to support your alternative lifestyle choices than your bog-standard neighbour. Which is what makes the intolerance of Sophie's story so much harder to handle. Sophie would have accepted you, but yet people didn't accept her. Sylvia, Sophie's mum, would later say that she saw firsthand the abuse and prejudice Sophie would be subjected to throughout her teenage years because of how she dressed, but I don't think anyone expected it to get as bad as it did. On Friday the 10th of August 2007, Sophie and Rob had been at a friend's house before setting off just before midnight to walk the 2 miles back home. En route, they stopped at a petrol station for cigarettes and chatted to some teenagers there. One girl even took photos of them. I mean, Sophie had these long dreadlocks, usually dyed red, and about 20 piercings. Rob had piercings, big backcombed hair, and he wore a lot of makeup. They undeniably attracted attention wherever they went. It was definitely a conversation starter a lot of the time. Just after midnight, so we're now on Saturday the 11th of August 2007, the two headed into Stubby Park in Bacup to cut across. Once in the park, they stopped to have a cigarette and shared them with a group of youths hanging around in the skating area. It was all said to be very amicable at first, they were just chatting, and then almost out of nowhere at 1:20 a.m, one of the group, a boy called Brendan Harris, hit Rob in the head, and then everyone just joined in attacking Rob. The two ringleaders were later identified as Brendan Harris and a boy called Ryan Herbert. The attack was sudden and brutal, and Sophie quickly jumped her boyfriend's defences, trying to shield his body with hers. It was described as a vicious mob attack from a group of youths. A 15-year-old witness would later tell police they were running over and kicking her in the head and jumping up and down on her head. I cannot explain how violent this attack was, so much so that when emergency services arrived on the scene, it's been reported that they couldn't tell if the pair were male or female. Their heads seemed to have been the main focus for the attacks, they were unrecognisable. The Rossendale Free Press reported a few days after the attack that both had swollen faces and were bleeding from their ears and noses. Rob suffered with bleeding on the brain and Sophie received severe damage to the right side of her face. She even had a piece of flesh missing from her head where attackers just yanked her hair out. The pair were rushed to Rochdale Infirmary before Rob was then transferred to North Manchester General and Sophie to Fairfield Hospital. Sophie was then eventually moved again to Hope Hospital's neurology unit, which was just a more specialised place to deal with her very severe injuries. Whilst Rob and Sophie were in hospital fighting for their lives, Burnley CID began an investigation into the attack, urging any witnesses to come forward to help them with the inquiry. Detective Inspector Dean Holden described this as a mob attack, saying that he believed they were assaulted by a large group of people and that they already did have a number of witnesses, but they still needed people to come forward. So this case was never a mystery. From very, very early on, investigators already had a very vague idea of who was involved and what had happened. Witnesses literally called in to 999 and live reported it to the receiver on the other end. This was never a mystery. It was just violent. It was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. The offenders didn't seem scared of having witnesses there. It didn't deter them in any way whatsoever. I think maybe at this point it's pertinent to talk a bit about the area in which this happened, Bacup, a small town in Lancashire in the South Pennines. Following the Industrial Revolution, Bacup became a mill town. It boomed within the textiles industry. But then deindustrialisation led to massive population decline, and much of the town's infrastructure deteriorated and just became derelict, despite government funding to try and help. Now, I've never been to Bacup, I can't speak personally to what this town is like, but crimerate.co.uk notes that it's the 27th most dangerous place in Lancashire. So it could be better, it could be worse. It's not the worst place to live. But it's also not a very well connected place, with the train station closing when the mill's closed, buses aren't fantastic, so ideally you do need a car to get around, which leads to a situation where teenagers especially are trapped and bored. There's not loads to do in Bacup, which leads to kids getting in trouble, to gangs being formed. It's also historically a very white place and a very straight place. According to the 2021 census, there are only 190 Asian and 52 black people living in Bacup, only 155 people who identify as Muslim, 8 as Hindu, and only 2 as Sikh. This is not the kind of town that you will often see anything that challenges your idea of white, straight, cis as the norm. In a Guardian article by Mark Hodkinson from August 2008, he speaks to a local drinking alone in a town centre pub. When Mark mentions how white the town has been on his walk through, the local smiled and remarked, "They get firebombed out of their houses and given a whack with a baseball bat to make sure they get the message." I am by no means saying that this is how every person in Bacup thinks, but this does feel relevant to Sophie and Rob. Obviously, they were white, and I don't know their sexual orientations, but they were at least straight passing to the outside world. They were together, but they were visibly different. They dressed differently than most people you would see in Bacup. It's not the most diverse of places. Sophie and Rob became targets to people who are scared of different, who are scared of diversity. Within just a couple of weeks of the attack, local police had arrested 5 teenagers they believed to be involved, all aged between 15 and 17. These kids were young. Now, their names weren't released originally because they were minors, but after the trial, the names of Brendan Harris and Ryan Herbert, who were thought to be the ringleaders, were announced publicly. But also, Daniel Mallet and brothers Joseph and Danny Holm were involved. Their names were released much later. They were all originally charged with wounding with intent, but then Sophie died. Whilst Rob eventually came round, although said to be suffering the side effects of the attack to this very day, as you'd expect, Sophie never woke up. It was very clear that the injuries she had suffered were too severe, and staff eventually determined that she would never be able to regain consciousness. On the 24th of August 2007, her parents, Sylvia and John, had to make the heartbreaking decision to turn off her life support. Sylvia and John released a statement saying, "We were proud to know our daughter. She was funny, kind, loving and brave. She was a beautiful girl with a social conscience and values which made her a joy to know. Not being able to see her blossom into her full potential or even to see her smile again is a tragedy beyond words." In a situation like this, parents being forced to make the most impossible choices, you wouldn't blame them for falling apart, but Sylvia had decided while she sat by Sophie's bed day after day, hoping that she'd wake up, that they were going to make a difference together. They were going to educate people about different lifestyle choices, against hate. They were going to teach people together to love everyone. A promise that Sylvia kept, even when Sophie didn't make it through. After Sophie's death, investigators renewed their appeal for information about the attack, and eventually on the 6th of September 2007, all 5 teenagers had their charges upgraded to murder. The gothic dress of Sophie and Rob was noted as a main motivation for the attack. Although only those 5 boys actually got charged, it was thought in those early days that as many as 15 people may have participated in the assault. However, by early October, investigators had questioned more than 100 people, and they concluded that although there were 15 to 20 people in the park at some point that night, most of them were not directly involved in the attack. I mean, every town has that one park that teenagers go to drink in. It's not always as nefarious as this, sometimes it's just teenagers being silly, but Stubby Lee Park seemed to have a particular problem with vandalism as well as underage drinking. The same teenagers always hanging out and causing issues for the local people overnight. This wasn't just teenagers being silly in their local park, this was gang involvement. Over the coming month or two, the case moved through the justice system, and on the 31st of October 2007, the 5 boys were finally charged with the murder of Sophie and of grievous bodily harm of Rob. In December, all 5 pleaded not guilty on both charges. However, by the time the trial began on the 10th of March 2008, they all pleaded guilty to the GBH charge, whilst Ryan Herbert, pled guilty to the murder, and Brendan Harris pleaded not guilty, and then for the other 3, the murder charges were dropped. The trial was difficult, the jury hearing about the severity of the attack from multiple witnesses who were there, hearing in detail the medical condition they were left in. It was detailed how Sophie and Rob had been attacked for no reason whatsoever, apart from their appearance. Detective Superintendent Mike Gradwell from the Lancashire Police said that this was the most violent murder he'd come across in his whole career, saying that he didn't think that Herbert and Harris seemed to recognise just how bad this was. They seemed to enjoy the attention. It wasn't taken seriously. When Harris was originally interviewed with his mother present, it said that they were just joking and laughing about the situation. They didn't take it seriously at all. Is this nature versus nurture, or maybe both? In the end, both Harris and Herbert were sentenced to life imprisonment, with the judge recommending that Harris serve at least 18 years and Herbert at least 16 years and 3 months. In his closing remarks, the judge described the attack as feral. At least wild animals, he said, when they hunt in packs, have a legitimate reason for doing so, to obtain food. You have none, and your behaviour on that night degrades humanity itself. The other 3 boys were all also sentenced, all having pled guilty to GBH with intent. Mallet was sentenced to 4 years and 4 months, whilst the Holm brothers received 5 years and 10 months each. All 5 boys appealed their sentences. Herbert did have his sentence cut by 9 months, but the rest had their appeals just dismissed. Herbert's minimum term was then cut by another year in 2020 after the judge said that he had made exceptional progress in prison. Apparently, he'd taken on a mentoring role in a rehabilitation program, and he was described as one of the most reliable, sensitive, and conscientious students. The judge also said, in 2008, Herbert was a young person whose only contribution to education was to disrupt, and he saw no purpose in learning. In 2020, he is someone who has a profound interest in his own education and the education of others. I mean, this is a really difficult situation, isn't it? The purpose of prison should be rehabilitation, particularly considering that these were just teenagers when the attack took place. But it's hard to make peace with that fact, considering what Rob went through, the brutality of the attack. There is no silver lining in this case, it is all just awful. But hopefully the attackers receive their punishment and turn their lives around. Hopefully they'll never do anything similar again. Hopefully once they're out of prison, they'll actively fight against it. Ryan Herbert was released in March last year, so 2022, with Sophie Lancaster saying that once again we have a justice system that fails to deliver. Brendan Harris remains in prison today. It seems in 2013 his sentence was actually made longer after he threatened to kill and attack a nurse in a secure psychiatric unit. It looks like he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and he'd been transferred from the young offenders unit to the psychiatric unit. In the aftermath of her daughter's death, Sophie Lancaster became an anti-hate crime advocate, and she established the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, which is a lasting legacy to Sophie's short life.
And how are you going to start to rebuild your life?
Well, we've got the Sophie campaign, so what I'll do is I'll work with that.
Tell us more about that.
Right, we use her initials, so it's stamp out prejudice, hatred, intolerance everywhere. And initially, if I could raise enough money, I would like a family room at hospital to thank the nurses for all the care, that they put in. But we want to educate people, in diversity, etc. And that really we're all the same. And I know that sounds quite to some people it's quite well, everybody does that, but the reality is no, they don't.
Thanks to Sylvia, in 2013, the Greater Manchester Police became the first in the country to officially recognise hate crimes against alternative subcultures. Now, this sadly didn't catch on across the rest of the country, but it was something. In 2014, Sylvia was awarded an OBE for her work. She truly was an incredible woman. In 2021, there was even a storyline based on Sophie and Rob on Coronation Street, which was something that was backed by Sylvia every step of the way. Two of the characters were subject to very similar abuse, and the episodes were put together with Sylvia's help. She said at the time, "We just want people to be aware of hate crime. Actually, I'm quite lucky that I do get to talk about it and that people do listen, because at the end of the day, she's not gone yet, is she? She's still here." Obviously referring to her daughter. Through Sophie's story being told, Sylvia feels like her legacy, her spirit is being kept alive. Sylvia sadly died unexpectedly in April 2022 following complications from a surgery. For the last 15 years of her life, Sylvia worked to combat prejudice and intolerance. She didn't want anyone else to suffer in the way that her daughter did. She worked tirelessly to combat lazy stereotyping that leads to prejudice. She celebrated people's differences. She celebrated people for all that they were. Sylvia's sudden death was a hard blow to all who knew her, but her legacy, like Sophie's, lives on through her foundation. People across the country are safer because of the work of the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, because of the work of Sylvia, who refused to fall apart after her daughter died. She wanted to fight, and that's what she did. Like I said, a large portion of the proceeds of this video will be going directly towards the Sophie Lancaster Foundation, but if you feel moved by Sophie's story at all and you want to make a direct donation yourself, I'll leave the link down below. It would be incredible. You are actively helping to change this world. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for choosing to spend this time with me and with Sophie, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.